Today, I'm going to be breaking down all the juicy topics that were discussed between Ilia Topuria and Joe Rogan on his most recent interview, because he touched upon a few very interesting conversations about the fight game, the behind the scenes, and of course his career as a whole as well. So before we get into it, let's just start off by saying English is the man's third language, and he just did a flawless interview for 2.5 hours with Joe Rogan. So I thought that was really commendable, first and foremost. But secondly, the interview is nearly on 1.5 million views, and it has only been dropped for a day. So that just speaks to the level of stardom that this man brings to the table in an era where stars are very much diminishing, and diminishing quickly in the UFC. So whilst we're on the topic of stardom, let's just start at the top of the tree with arguably the biggest conversation in MMA right now. Ilia Topuria versus Paddy Pimblett. Now, this was a conversation which made no sense whatsoever to a few people, or mostly all of the fan base, until this weekend at UFC 314, when Paddy went out and looked absolutely spectacular. And the reason why this is one of the biggest fights to make is, of course, the stardom that Paddy brings to the table, and the most important aspect to any fight in the UFC, which is a narrative. If you cast your minds back to when they were in London, there was the whole altercation where Paddy threw a hand sanitizer bottle at his head. Their teams were going at it, and that's where this beef essentially started. Paddy wrote a few tweets to Ilia, said, "You're not going to be anywhere, you'll be on the prelims." Fast forward a couple of years, he's holding the gold strap. Everyone's laughing at Paddy, but not so much anymore, because now he's only one fight away from a title as well. So that was a conversation that, of course, Joe Rogan and Ilia touched on, and Ilia said that's the fight that excites him the most. And it was McGregor, but he's at a point now, physically and mentally, and in regards to his career, it doesn't really interest him too much. And he did speak about how if you live a life like Conor McGregor, it has to catch up on you. It has to eventually come knocking at the door sooner rather than later. And that's exactly where he is now. So when he was speaking about a potential matchup with Paddy the Baddy, there was one thing that he said that I absolutely loved, and something that I've been petitioning for a very long time: the Bernabeu. Paddy Pimblett versus Ilia Topuria in the Bernabeu, which for more casual football fans is the stadium of Real Madrid, is the biggest fight and venue you can make in MMA right now. You could argue it's Islam and Ilia, and there's fair debate to that. But I just think the global appeal that Paddy brings to the table is something that Islam doesn't quite have. Of course, he has a phenomenal backing in the Muslim community, in Russia, which of course is an enormous region in itself. But the way that Paddy just transcends to the mainstream media, I don't quite think Islam brings that to the table. So when you cross that over with the fact you can put it in a stadium with 80,000 people, I think that's just a level of fight that we don't really have very often. And a major point to that is you can actually close the stadium as well. So Dana White has always been very vocal about not liking stadiums because of the unpredictability of the weather, and with it being in Europe, that problem just being exacerbated, which is completely fair. I also think another fair point just around that, without going into it too much, is it does dilute the experience. And if you've been to an arena and sat in the nosebleeds, you'll know it's not quite the same experience as when you're up close and personal to the cage. So if you do that in a stadium where you're just going to be miles away, the experience isn't quite going to be there. So can I see them doing that anytime soon? I don't think so. I don't think that's going to happen. But Anfield, the Bernabeu, Ilia Topuria and Paddy Pimblett, take my money, because that is one of the very biggest fights that you can make, with one of the best narratives as well. And when you're talking about narratives, I think it's important to actually touch on a few stories that Ilia mentioned about his time coming up in MMA, which I was very much fascinated with, because he does have a heritage with multiple regions, of course, being part Georgian, being part Spanish. There's a lot of influences in his culture and a lot of influences in his early life. And I think something which is very interesting to note about Ilia, he grew up in the MMA Spanish scene, which for all intensive purposes, didn't exist. He had 3 amateur fights and then had to go to the European scene to try and find fights, which is not necessarily uncommon. But you have to think that, yes, this man is a champion in 2024, whenever it was, but he was pretty much the first person to fly the flag for Spanish MMA. Now, there were people in the UFC before him, but I don't believe anyone had made it to the top 15. He was the first person to ever make it to the top 15, the top 10, the top 5, and then, of course, the champion. So he very much pioneered his way in this sport for Spanish MMA. So despite the fact MMA is a lot more established now, coming from that region, there wasn't much of a blueprint out there. But he said something which I love, a mindset which I love, and something which I try and think of myself all the time. If someone has done it, why can you not do it? And if no one has done it, why can you not be the first? And that sort of speaks to the mentality of Ilia Topuria that I love so much. And a story that he brought up with his old school training days with his brother, which I really liked, was just him talking about how obsessed he was with the process very early on. How he would go to the gym first thing with his brother and be the last ones to leave. But whilst they were there, they would just be watching their favourite boxers on rinse and then just practicing the skills, because he came from a judo background. He then did some wrestling, Greco-Roman wrestling as well back in the day, then started jiu-jitsu. But he only actually started boxing at 17, which sure is young in the general scheme of things. But when you look at the athletes and the kids that start in these disciplines, it is single-digit ages for the most part. Sometimes it's as young as 3-4 years old, especially when you're talking about something like boxing, which has been established for a very long period of time. And he mentioned that he would watch Canelo very often with his brother and try and replicate his moves and his sequences. And it made me think, as he was saying it, it makes perfect sense, because when you watch the way that he rips that left hook to the body, there's arguably no one that does that better than a Canelo Alvarez. So I actually thought that was pretty interesting. And one thing as well, which I wanted to touch upon with the training, which of course is something that not a lot of people know, and it's the fact that he actually started his career as a bantamweight and missed weight multiple times in Cage Warriors, even for a championship fight, I believe, which is not something which is discussed as much, because he was just knocking everyone out. And when you have a highlight reel with clean knockouts, people sometimes forget what the scale said. And I say sometimes because fans are very, very scathing about weight misses, and rightly so. When you sign on the dotted line, you sign to make weight. You don't sign to perform well. You don't sign to lose, win. You sign to make weight and make the walk. So I understand why fans get annoyed. For the most part, it can be managed outside of camp, which sort of leads on to something that he said about weight cutting, which I thought was actually very interesting, which was around the drug testing that they currently do, and using that as a way to integrate weight cutting protocol. So at the moment, obviously, there is absolutely nothing stopping you being 260 pounds and being able to make the weight 155. If you can do it and you can get on the scales and it calls your number, you can compete at that weight. And it's always been a question of, how do you mitigate large weight cuts? How do you mitigate the risk which comes along with dehydrating your body just before you go out there and compete at the highest level? Because not only is it just not very intelligent from a performance perspective, but of course the long-term risks are inherently dangerous as well. And he said something that I haven't really heard anyone say before, and it was about having the drug testers, when they come round, to weigh you, and if you sit past a 10% weight, so for example, if you're fighting at 100 kilos, just to use a round number, or 100 pounds just to use it on another metric, if you were past 110, then they would actually have to force you to fight at the next weight class. Now, I really like that idea. You could go out and say, why don't they just add more weight classes? I don't think the UFC are going to do that anytime soon. I think if they were going to, they would have done it sooner rather than later. And I also don't know if there's a tremendous amount of depth at the moment to do that. I could be wrong, but if you just start adding an in-between weight class every single time, I just think that would be too many. And even if it was one or two, I just feel like the UFC is a little bit too rigid to make those more drastic business model changes. Whereas all the athletes get drug tested and it is completely random. And you could say, well, they're out of camp and maybe it's their wife's birthday or they're going on holiday. That's a them problem. That is a them problem. The drug testing is completely random. So it at least makes you sit within a more natural bracket of your weight class, which I like a lot. You could have a strike system. So sure, if you're just over 10% once, okay, you get a strike. And then if it happens again, boom, you have to change. And like I said, that was something I haven't actually heard anyone speak about, but I actually really liked it. I really liked it a lot. So let me know what you think about that, because I actually think that's a really sensible change to make and a really frictionless change to make, which is arguably more important when talking about the UFC, because you don't want to make these drastic overhauls of the business structure and model, because there's going to be likely a lot more friction. So I thought that was actually a very good point that he brought up, but he also touched upon a topic which I'd be remiss if I did not include, and that was the fact that he brought up the name Lonnie Kavanagh. When they were speaking about Pantoja being at the top of the 125-pound division, he said that there is actually someone that Joe Rogan should look out for. He was on the UFC pay-per-view and he goes by the name of Kavanagh, and said that he is a very skillful fighter. And I think the truth is, when any MMA fan who just has a vested interest in striking, in MMA, when they watch that boy compete, you can't help but be a fan, because you'll understand the level of athleticism and then the skill set and then just the overall package that he brings to the table. He's young, he's Chinese, he's British, he comes from London, he's got cool heritage, he's got a cool story, does backflips and does his ninja shit only, and it really is just an entire brand's dream. So it was cool to get a shout out for Lon on the Joe Rogan podcast, because I mean, that is when you can say, Mum, I have made it. And it's cool that he's getting a sign off from Ilia Topuria. And little fun fact for you, he actually reached out to his manager Jose before his fight and said that he really wanted to go and meet Lon. And then of course there's that viral photo of them two backstage before Lon actually went out and performed. So it was cool to see him get a little shout out on there, and of course even cooler to see them in person get the photo. And that just speaks to, slight side tangent, but speaks to the absolute ridiculous stable of fighters that Jose Diaz at First Round Management currently has. Because I know he's got quite a lot of fighters, but some of the main names that I know he looks after: Ilia Topuria, Lonnie Kavanagh, and Nathaniel Wood. Now they're the ones, of course, that I know more personally, but there's a lot of big names as well in the mix that he looks after, and it just sort of speaks to his operating level in the management game and the moves that he's making. Simeon Powell, that I know in the PFL, Luke Trainer in Bellator/PFL as well. Again, ones that I know more personally, but a lot of very good people around that team of Ilia Topuria. A lot of smart people when it comes to business, branding, marketing. And to summarize this video, I think that's a good place to do it. Ilia Topuria is a very cerebral man inside the cage, but also outside of the cage. He's very switched on to the fact that you cannot be at the top of this game forever. And he doesn't want to be in it if he's not at the top. Now, that may sound obvious, but it isn't. Because a lot of people overstay their welcome in this game, especially when you're getting paid a lot of money and you think, go and make that wall, can I get paid $1 million, $2 million when you become a big name, but you're slightly past your sell-by date. I don't think that's the case for this man. He always said that he doesn't want to be in this game too long. I don't think he wants to compete past the age of 30 or early 30s that he said. And I think that would absolutely be perfect, because if he continues this momentum that he's going with, he continues to get an unbeaten record and continues to beat some of the best pound-for-pound fighters we've ever seen, we'll be speaking about his legacy for decades to come, because he does bring everything to the table. He's got the charisma, he's got the style, he's got the foresight, and now he's starting to get the mic skills as well. Like I said at the start of this video, it is his third language, so I appreciate the fact that it may have taken some years to get a little bit more comfortable on the mic, just ripping promos off the top of the dome, but now he's getting pretty flipping good at that, and he's getting good at articulating his thoughts and being very quick and witty with it. He's kind of one of those people who just, even if you're not a hater, which I'm not, you kind of hate him a little bit. On the front of GQ, looking suave in his Gucci suits. He's got a cologne named after him. He's looking dapper, knocking Max Holloway out on the front of the UFC. I mean, come on. What more can you do? He's really on top of the world at the moment. And I really hope this is a story that continues to just gather momentum in that trajectory rather than that one. Because we've seen it many times before. And we mentioned Conor McGregor's rise to the sport a little bit earlier. I think he studies and watches people like that and just navigates his career trying to not make those same mistakes. So just speaks to how impressive he is and how impressive I believe his career can be, and also how big I think that fight with Paddy Pimblett is. So let me know what you think of the breakdown. Let me know what you thought of the interview if you watched it. And let me know in the comments what other content you'd like to see moving forwards. And as always, keep it casual.